So now that that is done, I can make the stops for either side. The stops are going to determine how long your mortise is. You can see in the photo, this is what the stops look like. And they'll have a slot cut into them, and then they'll a wing nut, so you could adjust them quickly, will go through a hole in your base, and you could slide these back and forth according to the size you want. So these, the size of these is going to be based on the width of your router base. And now that I have that, I can cut those. I don't have an 1.5 inch piece of stock left wide enough, so I'm going to have to use that MDF again, but I don't think it makes too much of a difference with that. So I'm going to cut those 2 pieces, and these also have a rabbet on the bottom, and the edges are cornered off. So there's that side piece, and you can see how that's going to slide nicely in there once everything's done. It's going to come time now to cut all these slots. There's a slot on this one, a slot on the other one, as well as 2 slots in the back here, which is what's going to make this whole carriage ride back and forward. I'll cut those on my router table. These are 1/4 inch slots. I'm going to see what hardware I have for the back. They're supposed to be star knobs, and I think I have 5/16 star knobs, so I'll probably make those 5/16 slots. I have all my slots marked, and some of these are based off the measurements on the piece of paper, and some of them are just kind of based off of the modifications I made. So the slots for the side, I centered them in between my piece, and like I said, the width of this is dependent on your router base. Mine was 5 5/8, so I centered that, and then I drew a 1/4 inch mark, so I went 1/8 on either side to get that 1/4 inch. And then this is the front, so I came in 1 inch from the front, and then they recommend 2 inches wide. I made mine 3, so that's both of these. The center, I marked that, I kind of scribed that with my router. This one I'll be able to cut when it's in the tray, because the router rides perfectly front and back. This is a 3/4 inch slot by 6 inches, so I could cut that one when everything's ready to go and set up on my table. So in this one, they're using star knobs. I don't have star knobs. I was going to use these 2-sided knobs, but the bolt that goes through them is 5/16 of an inch, just to make my life easier since these are 1/4 inch. I had these circle ones that I think will work fine, that are 1/4 of an inch, that I could put in the back, and I did the same thing. Since the slot's going all the way through, I wanted it a pretty decent distance away from my dado so that this isn't super fragile in between here. Over 1.5 inches from each end, drew a center line to the front, and then same thing, went over each side 1/8 of an inch to get that 1/4 inch groove, and then I came in 1 inch from the front of my fence and 1 inch from the back, and that will be that groove right there. So before I route all my slots, I want to finish up my base by attaching this section with all the holes in it to the front of my piece. Now they give you measurements for this one. My measurements are based off the size I made for my base, so it's a little bit bigger because it's going to be screwed right to the front. So the concept with this is you have grids, 1.5 inches, a 1.5 inch grid. At each intersection you're going to drill a hole so that you can use these clamps to hold pretty much circular pieces, irregular pieces, square pieces, even end grain you could put in here. These clamps will hold it in place, and all the holes make it so that you can move your clamps around, and that will hold your stock in place. You can see it being used right there while you're routing. Now it looks like they actually made clamps for this that use T-nuts in the back to hold everything in place. I don't really want to make those, so I have these hold down clamps that I got from Rockler. I use these on my cross cutting sled and they work great. they're 5/16 of an inch. So I'm going to drill all these holes at 5/16 of an inch and see if these will work similarly to this without having to make anything or buy hardware for it. I could just mount these in there and move them around to hold pieces. To attach this, I just put some glue down, put this on top. I made sure that this top was flush, otherwise when your carriage comes over, if it was too high, it would hit it and take it off square. And then I tacked everything in place with some brads, went through and countersunk it and put some screws in, and that should be pretty solid. You can see how now my hold downs come through the back, and you could hold pieces by moving it around in the grid to get it where you need it to be. At the tail end of this build, I just have to cut all these slots, and like I said, to do that I'm using my router table. So I have a down cut bit in there, 1/4 inch bit, so it will cut my slots perfectly, and this bit will cut it pretty quickly. So then I moved my fence and I set it up on both sides so that you could see it's lined up to cut right through the center. And then I use these 2 stickers to kind of mark where the back end has to be put down on the bit, and then when I get to this mark I lift it up and it will cut this slot perfectly. I also put 2 arrows on both of them because since it's upside down and I can't see my marks, I'll know that this should be going towards the bit first and this side is towards the fence. So I'm going to take probably 1/8 inch passes. It should take 3 or 4 passes. MDF is pretty soft, it cuts really well with these bits, and get those ones done. So there's those cut pieces in my jig. You can see how they slide nicely in and out. So now I'm going to do the exact same thing for the back. If I set my fence up, I could flip it and do both at once. You'll see in the video what I mean if that doesn't make sense, but it's going to be the same process, putting some marks on there for stops and just going through this until those pop out. So similar process, but now I have 4 markers. So for the top side, I know I line up this back mark with that sticker, ride it till this sticker and lift it up, and then I can flip it, line the back up with that sticker, lower it, and then slide it until the back hits that sticker and lift it up. And keep doing that process until both of these slots are cut. Countersunk some holes in the side here and already attached it to my table. The nice thing about this piece in front, making it bigger, is it lines up with the edge of this and everything's just super solid on there. And I did that because first off, since the weight of this is going to be cantilevered off the jig, when it comes time to cut this middle mortise, if you don't have it screwed in, it might tip over. So the last thing I'm going to do to this before I cut that middle mortise is drill the 4 holes in order to use all these sliding mechanisms. Now the reason I didn't drill those beforehand is because you can see while this is nice and square, it follows that line, it is a little bit off from my original marks. Since I cut them identical, the fatter side's on the bottom over here. So by waiting, I can now go through and mark it where the hole is and get an exact spot. With my jig about here, I went about as far back as it would ever go before you'd be cutting a mortise into the tabletop. And then I could drill a hole right at the tip of these 2 slots, which means they'll be able to travel forward the whole distance that I have left here. So with these in place, and I had to use, you can't see it because it's screwed to the table. For these ones, I had to use a spacer on the underside because I thought the bolts for this were a little too long, and I went to go replace them, and the bolts are metric, and I don't have a lot of metric stuff here, so I just used a spacer on the bottom to buy me some depth, and now they tighten pretty nicely. So for these ones on the edge, I marked 1 inch from the edge. I could slide this over until I see my mark in the hole, and then I'll drill it there. That's everything in place. I'm going to switch out my bit, and I'm going to put a 3/4 inch straight cutting bit in there to make my first cut in here to make that opening for all the mortises. You can see how this slides in there nicely and hits the stop, so you get the size that you want. And that's about it. And I'm planning on using this later today. There's my stack of legs over there ready for mortises. There should be 4 in each leg, so I'm going to be putting it to good use. The thing I like about this is you can mount a stop on the bottom with a clamp, so once you get one set up, every single one's going to be identical after that. And then you saw to attach these, I used a washer on top and bottom as well as a wing nut, so it's easy to adjust. It's always a good idea to use washers in general, but especially on MDF, which is a little less durable as plywood, definitely less durable than a hardwood. This kind of spreads out the load of the pressure being put on all of this stuff, so you won't get pockets and holes in there. One drawback to this jig is, since I've made it the same size as the router I have, if your router ever breaks or you change routers, it probably won't work in this. The modifications to getting it work, especially if it's smaller, you could probably just trim everything, pop these off and move them and still get it to work, but that is something to consider if you're planning on getting a new router anytime soon. But the one nice thing about it is, since you have this 3/4 space, and it's centered consistent with your fence, the size bit that you put in there, 3/4, 1/2 inch, 1/4, is the size mortise that will route centered in this hole. So it's not just kind of a one-size-fits-all jig. You can route 3/4 mortises, 1/2 inch mortises, 1/4 inch mortises, and that's probably going to cover most of your needs. I was setting this up and I quickly figured out there was a lot left to be desired with the clamping system on this. I think mostly because the clamps I'm using, and most likely this jig in general, are designed for probably 3/4 inch to 1.5 inch lumber. I feel like that's a fairly common range. So my legs are thicker than that. At about 2 inches, so I was having a hard time getting some grip with these clamps on my lumber. After a little bit of problem solving, I actually came up with a solution that will probably make this whole process faster. So I mounted a straight board, which is actually a scrap piece of that cherry, using my clamps, and the piece I'm going to be routing can sit on top of that. So this clamp is holding this in place, so all I have to do to switch them out is loosen this clamp, slide this out, slide a new one in, and tighten that clamp instead of messing with these ones. These are actually a little bit hard to use when they're vertical because they're designed, I think, to be used mostly horizontally. And then it was actually really easy to set up my stop the same exact way. So that stop's going to make it so each piece lines up exactly the same, and that can stay in place for all of the cuts. Window, you could see how I lined the window up, turning these knobs in the back to center it over my yellow piece. And then you won't be able to see it when I put the router in there, but I put the router in there, I slid it to this edge, moved the stop and tightened it, and then did the same thing for this side. Slid the router so it cuts right up to the edge, moved the stop and tightened it. Now this is the first mortise I'm doing, and it's on the back side. So if it comes out a little small or a little big, I can make adjustments and you won't notice it on the final piece because it's on the back side. But once this is fine-tuned in, I should be able to cut all 8 of those exactly the same, move my stop a little bit for the bottoms, and do the bottoms as well. So I definitely cut all of these in less than a half an hour. I think I might film all 8 bottoms just to see how fast it is to cut them. But right now, shy of buying a domino for something like this, I think this might be the fastest way to cut these. I cut all those mortises yesterday. I moved that jig out of the way, and the review of the jig is that it's awesome. It worked better than I thought it would. And I've made a lot of jigs over the years. A lot of times they're good and they do what you want. It's pretty rare that they exceed your expectations, and this one definitely does. It makes really nice mortises, and it was easy. I thought it was going to be hard to keep changing the height and the dimensions of everything, but it was super quick. I cut all of these mortises in probably maybe 2 hours. So I think in total I had 36 mortises, and I cut all of them in a couple hours, so you can't really ask for anything better than that. And most importantly, like I said yesterday, the uniformity of them is critical in building stuff like this. And from the dead eye, they look perfect. You'll find out if they're really perfect when you go to put those tenons in place, but for now, pretty happy with it.